paper is by Jeff Prince at Indiana University, the Kelley School of Business, and Yusin Liu, all the same place, and me, looking at the household's willingness to pay for broadband. And in particular, we want to focus on how much consumers value speed in their home broadband. And just, I'll tell you what the answers are right at the beginning before we get into any of it. First is that their willingness to pay for bandwidth is highly concave. It's people are willing to pay an incrementally a fair amount as it goes from very low speeds up to 5 megabits per second and then to 10 megabits and so on. But all of the action really happens up to around 50 megabits per second. And once you start going above that, the incremental willingness to pay is much lower. You can see that in the figure there, that it flattens out. That people are not willing to pay a lot more for a gigabit per second than 100 megabits per second. And the red line showing the total willingness to pay per month, and the blue line showing it normalized at dollars per megabit per second. The normalization has some problems, but you can see the general conclusion. Second, on latency, people are willing to pay to reduce latency. People do value lower latency. Possibly, well, it depends on, I don't know what people's priors are, but it seems it's a moderate amount that we estimate between $8.50 and $9. We probably are giving an illusion of false precision here, an illusion of precision, but because it could be $8.67 a month. But and also that if you don't account for latency, then people exaggerate how much they value bandwidth, probably conflating the effects of latency and bandwidth together in speed. All right, now going back all the way to the beginning and why we care about this issue. There are lots of reasons why. ISPs, they invest billions of dollars upgrading their infrastructure, partly for additional bandwidth, and they compete on speeds. You can see lots of advertisements where the companies saying, we have the fastest available, and so it's in our it has real economic effect. Policymakers are constantly worrying that broadband is too slow. These are just a couple of quotes. And these are both Democrats, but I'd say it's a bipartisan concern that consumers don't have broadband that's fast enough. And the role of bandwidth has played an important part in policy decisions. We keep changing the definition of what broadband is. It started off as 200 kilobits per second up or down in 1999, changed to 4 megabits per second down and 1 megabit per second up in 2010, then to our current 25 megabits per second down and 3 megabits per second up. Although to get universal service funds, it's different. That's a 10 megabit per second down standard. And now there's an NOI where they're looking at this question again. And on the one hand, I mean, I've written some op-eds on this. Defining it is I think kind of silly. We want to know the distribution of speeds, and it's never going to be right to say that 25 megabits per second is broadband and 24 megabits per second is not. It's on a spectrum, but the definitions are important for policy decisions. And it has all kinds of implications. It'll affect merger policy because the definition affects how you think, how competitive you think the market is. It affects how we allocate funds for universal service. I mentioned that the universal service has a 10 megabit per second minimum right now. And it has implications for the upcoming auctions where you're weighted on speed. And we'll talk about that a lot later. And so those all have economic consequences. But so far, the definition has not taken into account consumer preferences. How much do consumers actually value bandwidth? The key question for all of the policy decisions should be, are the costs of whatever the definition is higher, worth the benefit? I guess I should have reversed that. Are the benefits of higher speed worth the costs that it entails? And of course, consumers and companies and everybody recognizes this in their real life because the advertisements are for speed, but they also say, get the speed at the price you want. And that's just the way we decide everything in life. Which raises another issue, though, is that people talk about speed, but people don't really know what all that entails. We sort of colloquially, we say speed is bandwidth, but really, and this is still, of course, simplifying it, but it's a function of bandwidth and latency. And so bandwidth is the maximum throughput of the path to your computer, and latency is the time it takes for a data packet to make a round trip between your computer and a server. And those two things together combine to affect the user's experience of speed. We give a highway analogy in the survey that we'll talk about later, where bandwidth is like the number of lanes on a road, and the latency depends on other things like how much traffic there is on the road and whether there are stop signs on the road and so on. Okay, but this implies two additional problems in terms of doing this, in terms of the research and the policy. One is, like I mentioned, consumers don't really know what speed is when you ask about it. And of course, why should they? They know what they experience, but not what the components are. And the second is that policymakers might conflate them when setting rules. Okay. So this is what I mentioned earlier, that with bandwidth, we believe that, and from earlier research, that going from dial-up to low-end broadband was, that was a huge improvement in consumers' experiences. Going from 1 megabit per second to 5 megabits per second, probably also enormous. You're going from a standard definition video feed with very little room for error to at least an HD feed. That's a big deal. Going from 5 to 10, probably also a big deal, so on. And going from 50 to 100, less important, and so on. So we want to know how that changes. And with latency, how much do consumers value the difference? The main difference is always between fixed line and satellite. And how much do consumers value that? Okay. So what we do is we measure the trade-off that people are willing to make by using discrete choice surveys. Oh, by the way, people should feel free to interrupt. I mean, it's a small group, so just stop and ask me questions, and then Jeff will answer them. And we have people make choices on these trade-offs, and it allows us to measure how much they value the incremental changes in things in bandwidth and latency. And then the third one that we mentioned, what happens if you ignore latency when talking about bandwidth? There's a lot of related literature sort of over the years on how much how much internet in general and broadband is worth. Some of it using time estimates, like the Goolsbee and Klenow paper. They've looked at the effects of housing data, housing prices, broadband connections and housing prices, where you find it's sort of a big effect at first that kind of tends to peter out after about 5 megabits per second. So a real effect, but then also sort of where you don't see an effect of faster speeds. And then others using surveys and experiments, and looking at substitutes and complements. The one that's closest to our paper is this paper by Greg Roston, Scott Savage, and Don Waldman, where they looked at willingness to pay for broadband back in 2010, a different era, and they sort of used kind of qualitative descriptions of speeds, which at the time was appropriate because people didn't really know what the numbers meant. And you might make an argument that still most people don't today, and we tried to deal with that. But they found a high willingness to pay for always-on, reliable connections, and very small, like I forget what it was, $3 or something, to go from high speed to very high speed.
And all these studies are just private households.
Yeah, there's no enterprise.
We do have the problem of telecommuting and people from home.
Yes, and in fact, do we have a telecommuting breakdown in the paper, or could we?
We can look.
I think
we have a. I don't know if we know.
It's a question to add to the survey.
Yeah, because we have. We'll get to what people do with their connections, and so that lets us break it down in lots of different ways. I don't know that we've done the telecommuting question, but that's an obvious. I mean, that'd be an interesting one because they have different needs.
You asked if they have 6 kids.
we know they have kids, but yeah. Right. Per kid.
far away.
So we use a survey here, and surveys have disadvantages. But the question is, why a survey on this? Well, there are two main reasons. One is that it allows us to introduce the kind of variation that we need to get some results and see how people are willing to how people make these trade-offs that we don't necessarily see or can't measure in the market. And also, it's the only way we can measure anything on latency, because consumers generally don't have that information. I mean, they can get it if they want to go to the Measuring America site at the FCC and look so on, but people don't do that. And a choice-based survey, as opposed to just asking people what they think, is that it mimics the market. We try to it's an approach that tries to essentially get them to reveal the truth, a truth revelation mechanism. And there's a lot of work, a lot of research on how to structure them now, and how to try to elicit honest responses and get the kind of variation that lets you answer the questions that you want. But the problems are that people, they're biased in their responses. They don't necessarily know what broadband features they have, and you have to construct the choices in a way that makes sense, and that people can understand and make plausible decisions between them. All right, so we have 4 parts of this to the survey: just their demographics, who they are, and so on, what they do, and what devices they use on the internet. The third is explaining to people what it is that we're asking about, because there's still the problem that people don't necessarily know what 5 megabits per second means, and so on. And so we take them through some exercises and give them tables and charts that they can refer back to throughout the survey. And so this is just an example, kind of the sorts of things you can do at different speeds and how long it takes to upload and download various files of different sizes. Okay, so we do the same thing with latency, which is a little bit harder to explain, but we do that through trying to describe the delays. And then finally we get to the actual experiments themselves. And these are basically asking people to choose among various hypothetical alternatives, and also then compare those alternatives to the current plan that they have. And an easy way to think about these, we call them discrete choice models, so that it sounds really sophisticated. And what do they call them? Conjoint analysis. But really, that's just a would you rather. So we should have included that question maybe, and they would have been more engaged. But
Screener.
Right, exactly. And so we show them something like this, and it describes 4 different. This one describes 4 different plans that vary among certain attributes, and we ask them to assume that all the other attributes, any attribute that's not mentioned, is the same across plans. And so we see that the bandwidth varies, the price varies, latency varies, and then they choose one, and then they go through these choices again and again, and after each one, then they choose it against their current plan. We ask if they would choose that one as opposed to their current plan, and then this will tell us something about their preferences and their willingness to pay. We actually have 2 versions of the survey. One includes questions about latency, and the other doesn't, and that's what allows us to ask how breaking them apart might affect how people report bandwidth, and when they're asked about that alone. So we do some pre-tests to see how it goes. The surveys were not especially long, so we didn't see any survey fatigue. Nobody reported any. People liked the highway analogies and the tables. They said they used them, but that they were useful. And like we said, a lot of people don't know what their current broadband plan is. They don't know about it, which I think in itself tells us some information. But so we had to kind of infer some information about their current plan.
You've heard the word for that, right?
Sorry, what?
You've heard the word for that? This is the Dilbert word. Confusopoly.
Confusopoly?
Yeah.
That's good.
It's a very good cartoon. We
will add it. So from the FCC data, which comes from Sam Knows as part of their Measuring America plan, based on where they are and the ISP they have, which they all do tend to know, and their plan, we sort of know generally what the level of latency is that they should experience. If they don't know whether they have a data cap, we assume it's unlimited, because it's effectively for them it must be, because unless they just get charged and never notice it, but you want to imagine one is. And then the upload bandwidth, that's people are much less likely to know that than the download, but we can sort of infer it based on the technology they have. The survey, we used a survey firm called Research Now, and to ultimately make it into the sample, they had to be subscribed to have a home internet subscription. They had to be the primary decision maker. They had to know their fee, monthly fee, and download bandwidth. And they had to take at least 4 minutes to answer the survey, so we knew that they weren't just speeding through to, just to get done. And so we ended up with almost 1,000 households using the survey that also asked about latency, and 430 that didn't. And so this is just should have made the font bigger, but sort of some summary statistics, what people do with their internet's pretty consistent among what you've seen in other surveys: email, shopping, social media, banking, video streaming, and so on. Telework is actually at the bottom of this one.
Oh, we do have it.
Yeah, we do have it. That's interesting. I hadn't paid any attention to it before. I'll think about that more. This would be just I don't know, 3 or 4 months ago, maybe 6 months ago now. I mean, pretty recent.
It was this year.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe April.
I don't know whether that seems like a reasonable for telework or not. Maybe it is. I mean,
It doesn't.
I mean, it's going to depend on occupation, and if that's if it's a representative sample.
Was this nationwide?
Nationwide and representative. It's intended, based on all the demographics we have anyway, a representative sample of households.
Places don't have the traffic that we have. So.
Right. And it's data across the satellites, across the services, mostly sort of about what you would expect, and with distributed across technologies at about the rate you would expect. Jeff, you want to take over? Here, why don't you just 20% DSL, yeah. So,
That was low.
yeah, that's low. And we wonder a little bit about the DSL fiber thing because of UVerse, and people who have AT&T may not be sure whether they have UVerse or DSL.
Yeah, one other thing to point out on this slide, so it's not self-evident what that switch is, but that's capturing how many people, when we gave them the option between their preferred plan from the 4 that we present them, and then in the second instance they get to choose whether they want that or their current plan. This says roughly about half choose to switch. So they would choose the one they picked from the 4 instead of their current plan. And the reason we put this is, one of the goals in constructing the survey is to try and make it seem kind of realistic in the marketplace. So you don't want that to be like at 100% or at 0%, which would indicate either all the options are just out of this world great or just awful, right? So we seem to be somewhere in the sweet spot of plans that people would reasonably compare to what they're currently doing. So, okay, so here's the fun part. So this is why Scott passes it over to me now. I have to go through the Greek stuff. So essentially the question then is, how do we get these numbers? So people make choices, and we're supposed to then back out what does this mean in terms of how do they value these features. And the standard approach to this is really built upon Daniel McFadden's work, where you basically say, look, let's think about people find utility from a product, which depends on that product's features. And so we can use this kind of utility construct to compare different products in terms of how much utility do they provide. So more utility, more preferred, right? So there's the features themselves that contribute to utility, and then there's other things that we don't have measures for, which is that error term, that second component in the utility function. So this is how you would construct it for a given option. So think about an internet plan. It has X's. It's the data cap. It's the bandwidth. It's the latency, right? Those are all the X's. They contribute to utility. For the status quo, we have one added feature. That's that SQ term there. All that is an indicator. So it basically says if this is the current plan that you have, perhaps it in and of itself provides you a different amount of utility. So capturing the idea that sometimes people just get extra value in sticking with what they have, or they might even get extra value from switching from what they have. So we don't take a stand on whether that coefficient on status quo is positive or negative. We just allow for the possibility that people might think differently about the plan they currently have as opposed to some other hypothetical plan that they don't currently have. And then we allow that to be different across people. So some people might feel differently about the status quo than others. We can put a distribution on that and estimate its parameters. So once you've formulated it this way, and this is what'll win you a Nobel Prize, is you can get some very easy to construct probabilities. So once you
The first time it would win you a Nobel Prize.
that's right. The first, yeah. Nowadays, yeah, I might have trouble with it. But so with this utility formulation, essentially it allows you to construct probabilities that a choice will be made. So think about the first part of the question where we give you 4 plans to choose from. With that utility construct, then there's a simple formula, and it's this one right here, that is the probability that any one plan will be chosen. So it's essentially thinking about the utility of that plan in relation to the utilities of the other plans that are being offered. And then for the one that involves the status quo, the only difference is you've got that added term in the utility function, but the probabilities calculate exactly the same way, and then you get this integrand in front simply because there's a distribution in how people feel about the status quo. So once you have those probabilities, you can just estimate the parameters using maximum likelihood. So essentially you're saying, for what values of those parameters, for what values of those betas, meaning how do those features contribute to utility, do the choices we actually observed generate the highest probability? So are the actual observed choices as likely as possible? And so once you've got those parameters estimated, then you can go and crank out willingness to pay. So essentially, these become very simple formulas. So you'd say, if you give me the marginal utility for download bandwidth, so that's the beta dB there at the bottom, and then you give me the marginal utility that people get for money, right? And that's going to be come in as a negative number in our model because this is talking about price. So every time the price goes up, you lose money. And so then you'd say, okay, then how much is that feature worth to me? Think about the marginal utility it provides relative to the marginal utility of $1. Once you take that ratio, then you're giving me how much it's worth in dollars terms instead of just utility terms. And so that gives us a simple way to then calculate what are these different features and their different levels worth to people on average. And so here's what comes out. So once you apply those formulas, you can think about just sketching out what's the value of going up download levels. And these are the different levels that we put into the survey. So, and what was the baseline? Do you remember? 6 megabits per second. So then you go from 6. So these are all relative to the baseline level. So you then say, okay, I go to 10, I go to 25, and then all the way to 1,000. This is how much people on average are willing to pay per month for that improvement.
So 1401 is the cost point, is the reward going from 6 to 10, is it?
Correct.
Not from 0.
That's right.
That's correct.
Right, the full willingness to pay would be higher.
Would be substantially higher, yeah. And then this is giving the comparison. So we talked about how we had 2 separate surveys, one that includes latency as a feature and another one that's exactly the same other than it does not include latency. And what you can see is the one where there's no latency, that's the red dashed line. It's always above the blue line throughout. And what that's capturing is, and this is just looking at download bandwidth. So it's essentially showing that when you remove latency from the survey, it appears that download bandwidth is picking up some of that latency value, right? So people are then valuing download bandwidth more when latency is not included. And I think this is especially credible given that the different participants have no idea that there were two separate surveys, right? So this is being picked up with people not even being cued to think about that latency's been removed from the survey. It wasn't even put on their radar to begin with. So then, as far as latency is concerned, the main results play out when you get to the higher numbers. So these are negative as you get higher because it's essentially capturing this is a bad, right? So this is an actual. Seldom is it the case that we deal with products that have features that we designate as bad, but this is the way it works with latency. So the bigger the number, the worse it is. And so this is capturing that when you go from essentially no latency at all, when you get up to the bigger numbers, this is where our very precisely estimated $8.66 comes from. And then we haven't emphasized this, but we also were able to capture value for data caps. So as you go, and what was the baseline here? Do you remember? Was it 250?
I think it was 250 because this is what Comcast started with originally. I think is how we picked it.
Okay, so if you have 250 gigabytes of data, then if you go from that to 600, people are willing to pay about $12 per month. You go up to 1,000, gets you to 2,350, and then all the way to unlimited gets you up to 5,820. So there is a pretty large premium on the unlimited that we're estimating. And one other thing I wanted to mention is when you remove the latency from the survey, you see the difference in the bandwidth estimates, but it doesn't show up for the data cap. So it does seem to be that it's something in the same space, which is bandwidth, so they're both kind of playing in the speed space, but not something else at another dimension like data caps isn't picking up that value.
And also just to add one, just to emphasize what you said, if you look at the different levels of data caps, you see sort of the same thing as with the willingness to pay for bandwidth, sort of a decreasing marginal utility of additional data transfer until you get to the unlimited. Now, of course, it's hard to measure, normalize unlimited, but based on the amount of data that people use, it shows that people sort of very rationally have this decreasing marginal utility until they get to unlimited, and then there's this, like Jeff said, this big premium on unlimited. People are willing to pay a lot for that.
It's like an all-you-can-eat buffet.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. I'm not going to use it, but boy, it's great to have it. And then for those that like it all in one place, this is the full gamut of results here. So download. So we didn't really talk a whole bunch about upload, but that's in there as well. So I think that's starting at 1, and then bumping to 3, 25, and 100. Again, showing kind of similar concavity to the download. And so another thing to emphasize, so this came up earlier as far as trying to break this down across groups. Some things we did look at are how our estimates differ depending on certain demographic features like education and income. Differences are as you'd expect. There's a notable difference in their evaluation for download bandwidth. So higher education, higher income value it more. And then the big one for us, I think, was when you think about latency, there's some clear groups that should care more than others, especially as you even bump up from relatively low levels. And gamers really stand out as one of those groups. So if you're a gamer, if there's high latency, you're going to notice it, right? And they did respond in the survey that way. So they started to show aversion to latency quickly compared to everybody else.
Have you looked at what happened in the UK when a company went out and specifically targeted the gamers?
No.
They actually built a system, very low latency, and said, this is it, win the game. And they've been the fastest growing ISP in the last 3 years, I think.
Oh, interesting. Oh, that's really cool.
It's a different topic, but did they get caught up in any net neutrality debates?
I don't think so.
Interesting.
All right, so where can we apply some of this? So this, as Scott was saying earlier on, if you think about the Connect America Fund auctions, these are reverse auctions to allocate about $2 billion. And they have a scoring system for the bids. So if you want access to some of these funds, you put in a bid, and you'll be scored accordingly. And so here's the basic formula that they currently have on the books for the scoring. And the key things that are going to be related to what we're working on are those last two pieces. So there's the performance weight and the latency weight. And they're really penalties. So they're going to allocate points that contribute to your score, and more score is bad. So it's like golf. You don't want a high score here. And so just to give you a sense, here's how they lay it out. So here's the performance tiers. So if you're at the minimum level, you get a lot added to your score, right? So you get 65 points added if you're at minimum. So you have to be at least 10 down and 1 up. But if you're below 25 down and 3 up, puts you in the minimum on the bandwidth. And then the usage allowance, you have to have at least 150 gigabytes. And then you can see you kind of walk up the line. So it's a combination of the bandwidth and usage allowance that determines where you are on the performance tier. And then the latency is even simpler. So you're either low or you're high. And this really boils down to, are you fixed line or are you satellite? If you're fixed line, you're going to be low. If you're satellite, you're going to be high. It's pretty much as simple as that.
What's a mean opinion score?
I don't exactly know the definition of that.
Yeah.
It's weird. It was another thing in there to make sure that it included satellite.
Yeah, I've seen this in other contexts. But yeah, yeah. I'm sure they've got it laid out somewhere how they crank that out, but I don't know that one off the top of my head. All right, so did the FCC get the weights right? Right, so that's the magic question. That's right. So the case we would make is that performance and latency weights should reflect consumer valuation. So how we trade off good and bad performance and good and bad latency should reflect how consumers make those kinds of trade-offs. And so if you think about the bandwidth weights, right, they reflect a decreasing willingness to pay. So if you just plot the points that get added to your score based on the FCC rule, right, this would be the simple plot that you would find. And this, roughly speaking in shape, right, matches what we saw with willingness to pay when you think about kind of the marginal change in willingness to pay as you increase download speed. So the bandwidth scoring really isn't that bad. So let me kind of walk through this table. So the first column with figures in it is the score, right? So we've got our 4 tiers for performance. The lower you are, the more points that get added. The next column over is how much your score goes down as you move up to that next rank, right? So minimum to baseline, you save 20 points. Baseline to above baseline, you save 30 points. Above baseline to gigabit, you save 15 more. So then you can say, all right, well then what's the change relative to the previous change? So like, how much am I, relatively speaking, how much am I getting in savings in terms of points relative to the last jump that I made? So now we're thinking about it in terms of jumps. So you can say, all right, when I went from above baseline to baseline, I get a 1.5 times, right, jump compared to the prior jump from minimum to baseline, right? So I get 30 instead of 20. When I go above baseline to gigabit, I get 15 instead of 30, so I'm only getting half the bump, relatively speaking. Then when you move one column over, we've got our willingness to pay figures. These are coming from our estimates for the download bandwidth and from the data caps, how much consumers on average value those things in terms of willingness to pay. So when you move up those tiers, how much change on average in willingness to pay are you seeing from the consumers? How does that compare relatively speaking as you compare the jumps? Right, so the proper comparison point would be then the 1.7 to the 1.5 and the 0.6 to the 0.5, right? So how do the willingness to pay figure jumps compare to the score jumps as you move up the tiers? And as you can see, those are pretty darn close, right? So it seems like they're getting it pretty much on the nose almost. And then you could also think about this in terms of what's the willingness to pay per point. So for every point that you get taken off your score, what on average is a consumer willing to pay in terms of what that implies, right, for the performance and for the performance enhancement? And again, you can see, you know, it's not perfect, but they're somewhat in line, right? So you want it to be that the willingness to pay per point is uniform across the points, right? So a point is a point is a point. So you'd want it that each point that you're giving these guys, you're getting comparable value out of the consumer.
And given the measurement error we certainly have, it's pretty close.
Yeah, I mean these.
Pull those weights out of the air, or did they?
Well,
That's a good question.
They, if you read the comments, they say that they were not arbitrary, but they don't say why. So I don't know. But what if they did? It worked.
Yeah, but before you say that.
Well, they may have had business data from the
Yeah,
various
it could be.
players, and they could have done some pricing modeling based on that.
Well, before you say they got it so right, let's go to the other chart. So now let's think about this in terms of latency. So here what we're going to be thinking about is what is the improvement? How many points do you get when you go from low to high latency? Here it's 25, right? And then what I can do is say, well, let's think about the relative point improvement from going from low to high latency versus moving up these performance tiers. So you'd say, look, if I improve my latency, I get 25 points. If I go from minimum to baseline and performance tier, I get 20. So, and a latency improvement gives me 1.25 times, right, the points that moving up that one level in the performance tier from the bottom to the second from the bottom. You could then make the same calculation in terms of how much are you getting in terms of willingness to pay improvements, right? And if you recall, the latency improvement gives you $8.66. We can then go and say, let's compare that to $33.37, right? So I'm only getting 26 cents on the dollar when you think about it in terms of willingness to pay, relatively speaking, from that kind of improvement comparison. But I'm getting 1.25 points, 1.25 times the points, right? So there's this big misalignment between how much is the willingness to pay enhancement, relatively speaking, between latency and performance, and how much is the point enhancement between latency and performance. And the relative measure would be about 5 times. So you're basically getting 5 times the points relative to the value when you think about it in terms of latency versus the performance tier. Another way to look at that is that bottom table. Remember how we said willingness to pay per point, right? We think that should be uniform, because you'd say a point is a point is a point in your score. And so we should be getting the same value for the points in terms of consumer value. And so those were all, in the neighborhood of $2 per point willingness to pay. With latency, we're all the way down to 35 cents. Right? And so there's a big difference in terms of what the implied value per point is when you think about it in terms of latency versus the performance tier. And so this is the part where there seems to be a bit of a mismatch.
So just to make sure I got that right.
Yeah.
So you're getting punished 5 or 6 times more for having high latency than you are for having low bandwidth.
Relative to what consumers, how consumers seem to value.
Correct.
Right.
That's right. That's right. So the takeaways then, the valuation of bandwidth is highly concave. Households moderately value latency. If you leave it out of the survey, it tends to exaggerate the bandwidth value. And without this information, policies may inadvertently under or overweight characteristics that consumers care about. And we'll leave it at there. Yeah.
Brandon.
So, I mean, you guys capture the state of the world now. It seems like you do a great job of that. What about the state of the world, I don't know, projected like 5 or 10 years down the road in terms of, I mean, it's kind of impossible, I guess, in some sense, but, if data is projected to increase based on usage and based on, like, the number of devices actually there, then what does that do to the cost calculations, and how does that affect, I don't know, how they should weight their pricing and like in the cap auctions?
Well, so first, I mean, like you said, that's hard to know. Like the saying goes, it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future. But it's always, when people talk about future-proofing networks, that's always difficult because you want to, and you don't want to make an investment today that would be cheaper to make in the future, right? So it's sort of inherently difficult to answer that. But on the other hand, I mean, it also will depend on what you think is the importance of bandwidth versus latency going forward. And in your example, bandwidth becomes more important, right? Even more important relatively than latency. But it could be the other way around too. So I could keep going, not answering your question for a while. Jeff, do you have something to add?
Well, let me chime in and not answer. No, actually, Scott's last point is exactly what I was going to chime in on. So even though we can't predict it, I think it is a good thought exercise to say what are the things we see coming down the pike, like you were saying, as people have more devices connected at home, it could put more pressure on bandwidth demands. And then that presumably then should raise the value of bandwidth. And if all else stays equal, then it would say this is even going to be more out of whack if you don't change the system. But the caveat is, maybe there will be changes that make people feel differently about latency as well. And so that would kind of even things out. But so while we can't, sit here and say here's what the numbers would be 5 years from now, it is reasonable to make qualitative kind of forecasts as to what do we think is going to be the relative evolution of these speed features based on where we think the technology is going and where we think kind of consumer expectations are going. So I think that's totally reasonable.
Have you thought about the supply side? Is it cheaper or more expensive to provide bandwidth over latency or vice versa?
Well, so with satellite, there's not a whole lot they can do about latency.
Space is still space.
Right.
Yeah.
You could try to increase the speed of light, but
There's a bill introduced on that.
with quantum, build some quantum nets. Yeah. And actually, that's right. There is always talk about the low Earth orbit satellites. That would make a big difference. But I think that's pretty costly. Although people keep talking about it.
Is involved in it. So.
So right. Yeah. We'll have a hyperloop that goes straight up to it. But I think part of this, I mean, we know that there are cost models for all kinds of things, although I don't think any of them necessarily take into account latency at least what I've looked at. The idea here is to try to bring in the demand side because we do know something about the supply side. And I don't, and on the latency side, I mean, the best you could do is try to bring some evidence to bear on what the FCC is deciding about this, has decided about the relative benefits.
I agree.
Mike Nelson with Cloudflare. We're a web security firm, but we're also a CDN.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of what we do is try to provide lower latency using the existing infrastructure. And we certainly have lots of customers who were willing to pay us to make that happen from the content and website. But I used to teach classes on how to predict the future over at Georgetown. And so I'm going to try to answer his question.
All right, go for it.
Ask you a question based on that. You were right that we are going to have a lot more devices, but it seems to me that would then lead us to start asking, are the networks reliable enough? So question number one is, has anybody done any work on reliability as a factor that people want? Obviously with Dish and some of the other networks, rain fade is a problem. Fixed wireless, same thing. And then the second question, you were asking about upload speeds, but I didn't hear any comments about upload speeds. And yet in the future, as people have tween cams so they can watch their 11-year-old when they're not there, and you have a lot more video coming out of the house, there may be higher demand for upload speeds. Any comments on either of those two things?
I didn't want to watch my 11-year-old while I was there.
It brings a whole new perspective on helicopter parents. Call them NSA parents.
So we didn't we only spoke briefly on that, but upload, I mean, at the highest level, it mimics the general pattern of download in terms of its concavity, but
But you weren't giving people choices, same download.
oh, we were.
But you didn't see much, in other words.
Well, no. So we got those estimates. So all else equal, if you go from 1 megabits per second upload to 3, they're willing to pay $10 a month, and then up to 18, up to $24.50.
Okay, and that 3 is going from 1 to 3?
Correct. Yep.
And I mean, and the incremental willingness to pay is less than for the same increments in download.
Yeah.
But I mean, we didn't really talk about this, but it is a higher ratio than I expected.
I'm amazed.
Yeah, it was actually
That's why
pretty.
I asked the question because I overlooked that part of it. But it does seem in the future that demand might go even further.
Yeah, could be. Yeah, I wish we sort of had something to compare it to in the past to see.
And you didn't
How it's
quiz
changed.
people when they ran into problems. You didn't ask people if they exceeded data caps, or you didn't ask if they ever run into problems uploading things. And
We did ask if they've exceeded their
Yeah,
data
but
cap.
not specific, not connected to upload.
No, not connected to upload.
I was curious on both questions. The data caps,
Yeah.
a large number of people report that they had exceeded their data cap.
No,
No,
I don't remember.
I don't remember the figure, but yeah, it wasn't like 20%. It was below 10, I think. But actually, just to follow up.
I'm curious whether, it would be interesting to know if every
agree.
so often
Yeah.
people get really
Should we go back?
frustrated because, God damn it, my baby video doesn't upload properly.
Well, another thing that I think is important that I think is related to your point is, if you notice, we got our 4 key features that we estimate, and they all come out as being significant in value, but only one of those is not included in the FCC's scoring table, which is upload, right? So that's kind of interesting.
I mean, no, there's a down up.
Is it
It's a-
down
it's a
up? Is
combination, yeah.
the performance down and up?
Yeah. And
Oh, sorry. Never mind. I apologize.
And we built it into our-
That's right. We did build it in. Sorry, I was thinking it was only down.
That's
Yeah.
symmetric.
Yeah.
The theology of the day, but
Yeah.
that's long since gone.
You know, the reliability point is also interesting.
Yeah.
Because in this, Greg Scott and Don's paper in 2010, people did put a high value on, and these of course are just consumers, not enterprises, but a high value on, I forget exactly how they put it, but it was something related to reliability,
Yeah.
right? And, you know, I imagine that the definition of reliable even has changed between now and then. But people put a pretty high value on it then. I would imagine, you know, at least as much now. I mean, we didn't measure it, but yeah, I mean, as people are doing, as the you know, how important the things are people are doing
Yeah.
increases, you would expect that to go up.
A number of times that I've heard friends complain on Facebook in the last year about being on hold for an hour to get Verizon or AT&T or whoever to fix their internet connection. It's always in the middle of some baseball game they want to watch or something.
Yeah.
Thanks. Very good.
Thank you. Thank you.
Could you actually go back to the cognitive buildup table?
Sure.
From sort of like a consumer policy perspective, that's actually super interesting, and that is not at all how, like when you're shopping
What?
for, yes, when as a shopper, like when you're shopping for your home internet, like you don't get to do that, and nobody advertises this way, or nor is it even transparent. Like they don't say like, and our latency is this, and our whatever. So I'm curious if this could be used, one, as like an education tool for people to actually know what kind of internet they have, but two, in the discussion about like what is and isn't broadband, to make that discussion more inclusive of different factors, which I think is what you're suggesting we should do. Could it be something like this, where policymakers look at that and say, okay, like this amount is what we think every American should have, or most Americans should have, or whatever. Is that? reactions?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that's totally reasonable. I think, I mean, just to put things in context related to what we were working on. I mean, one of the things we wrestled with a little bit was this idea that, when people are shopping, they don't see this kind of stuff. So then, how do you think that in terms of the survey? But our point of view on that is that we want to know how people value things when they know what they're valuing, right? So it is actually important in this case. We're not trying to replicate how people value it when they're trying to go make the purchase. We're thinking about how do they value it when they know what it actually is.
Right.
Because I would say that's what the government should care about. That's what policymakers should care about. Like, for informed consumers, what is this worth? And then I think what you're pointing to is that there's value independent of that, just in getting more kind of clean information out there as to what are these products, what do they actually deliver.
I think a couple of things. One is a lot of ISPs do have information kind of like this. When you sign up, how long is it? How many songs can you download in a minute or something at different speeds? But it's usually at least a click away.
Yeah.
Kind of
Right.
down, right?
Yeah.
So it's some kind of discrimination. And the other is on the government side, that that always ends up being part of a debate. It ends up turning into a debate about how people differ on what they think society should provide, right? Because some people say, okay, well, all you need is once you got a 5 megabit per second connection, you're good because you can watch video. And then some say, well, but why should people in rural Utah why can't they watch 2 videos at a time? Those differences are really hard to.
Well, but right now
overcome,
there's
so.
not even a vocabulary, I think,
that's
for
true.
policymakers to talk about it, right? Because, people just throw out, it's, this many up, this many down, and then, because I sort of entered the space from, not knowing anything to knowing a little bit, and it's first it's okay, well, what does this even mean? And then it's you start talking about speed, and then this person's oh, but latency, and then, oh, but this other thing, right? So there's no real common vocabulary about what is and isn't broadband, or so before you can even talk about what should society provide, what are the different planks even, right? At this speed you can do a cat video, at this speed, this speed latency you can telework, and you know what I mean, that kind of thing. So maybe, I don't know, suggestions for future research, or if anybody else around the table has thoughts on this.
I think that's a good point. The other thing I'll throw out there, just playing in this space a bit, a lot of times you find this information from ones that have different incentives on this. I've seen this a lot from Netflix, right? So they want you to know, so you've got the connection that allows their product to come to you at the highest quality. So a lot of times it could be that you get the information from a different source than the one that you're actually planning to purchase from, right?
But even that can confuse people too. So I was looking at Netflix's data just the other day, and the ISPs at the top, they'll say we're streaming at 4.5 megabits per second, because that's all you need, even for I forget where the Ultra HD
Yes,
that might even be up to 10. I'm not sure, but you can stream Netflix Ultra HD at less than 100. But in any event, so they want you to make sure you can get the best from them, but they don't care whether you buy 100 megabits per second from. So yeah, everybody's always different. Well, yeah, it's a good point. There's
no common vocabulary, right?
Right, to your point.
What's the Finnish definition? The Finns have declared broadband a human right.
That's right. Yeah,
Is it 20?
I think so. Something like that.
Very
Yeah.
fast.
Did they include latency in that?
That is not a right. That's a privilege. Latency is a privilege.
Bandwidth is a right. It's a privilege.
Latency is a privilege.
There's a lot of laps in the north that are not
Probably right.
Cool. Who funded the work?
Nobody funded the work.
Always the best work done.
Hey,
Done for the joy of research.
it was a pleasure. Well, thank you all for the comments. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for checking all the way out here.
Yes. We have a trek to do ourselves. What do we say, 2:30?
2:30.
Yeah, all right. So we don't